Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Coming up on today's show.
Hamas will understand that by attacking us, they've made a mistake of historic proportions. We will exact a price that will be remembered by them and Israel's other enemies for decades to come.
A brutal attack and a vicious retaliation that threatens the stability of the world order. Our business correspondent, Simon Pusey, Greg Swenson, the chairman of Republicans Overseas UK, and reporter Alex MacDonald, who is also a commentator at Middle East Eye, will all be joining me here in the studio for their assessment on a savage conflict that has divided opinion. And the leader of Britain's opposition has promised to fight the next general election on economic growth, refuting the government's claims that the Labour Party would bankrupt Britain. Harry Burns, the Vice President of Crestview Strategy, was at this year's annual conference, and he'll shortly be joining me with the highlights. Then later, I'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. But first, the British Prime Minister has released a joint statement with the leaders of France, Germany, Italy and the United States of America, expressing their steadfast and united support to the state of Israel and their unequivocal condemnation of Hamas. The development follows pro-Palestinian protests in the British capital on Monday. The demonstrations, which were held outside of the Israeli embassy, prompted the British Home Secretary to ask police chiefs to consider issuing public order offences for anyone seen waving the Palestinian flag. Well, for more on this, I was earlier joined in the studio by our business correspondent, Simon Pusey. Simon, so the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, he's spoken to leaders of the USA, France, Germany and Italy. They've released a joint statement, basically doubling down on what we've heard throughout the week, which is they stand with Israel. But then, of course, these are major metropolitan cities. We've seen protests in London as well of people that are pro-Palestinian. We know that the Home Secretary is speaking with police about whether or not waving the Palestinian flag would be illegal. Can you just talk to me about how we're able to balance this really delicate situation? Yeah,
delicate's very much the word. Suella Braverman writing to police leaders to say that this could be a crime. So she's basically sort of advising them on what they should be doing in these cases, and it is very delicate. So you've got people coming out with Palestinian flags. Now that happens a lot around London and around other cities. There's big Palestinian communities. The problem is doing it just after a huge terrorist attack by Hamas, and Hamas is a terrorist organization recognized as such by many countries around the world. That is inflammatory, and I think that is, Suella Braverman's basically correct to come out and say it's
divisive.
Exactly. Things like that will only increase tensions and increase the likelihood of more violence and more conflict. And so she's saying various slogans, various chanting, obviously swastikas, just trying to not, increase incendiary violence, which has already happened. So the whole issue at the moment is so delicate and hard to sort of keep the right balance. So I think basically, the correct way that the UK government has done is to say that they stand with Israel against terrorist organisations, while also using language that reflects the fact that the Palestinian community feel like they've been hard done by for decades and decades. And so, I think the Foreign Secretary recently used the phrase, measured response, or trying to keep it in mind, the response from Israel. There needs to be a point at which they don't go over a certain line. So it's really hard for the governments and for everyone involved in this to try and but I think the main thing that we're seeing in London and in the UK with Suella Braverman is to not stoke tensions any further. So that, of course, will have people from the free speech side, from people saying, we shouldn't be encouraging censorship. Well, this is going a little bit too far. We're creating new crimes now for saying certain things. But at such a sensitive time, after close to 1,000 people have been killed in a terrorist attack, I think it is probably right that, the police do make sure that the Jewish community feels safe and do not feel further persecuted.
We'll be keeping a close eye on this, of course. Thank you, Simon. Well, for obvious reasons, before we head to the break, we'll be staying with the developing situation in the Middle East. For more on the US response, Greg Swenson, the spokesperson for Republicans Overseas UK, joined me earlier on in the studio. Greg Swenson, as always, it's a pleasure having you in the Channel's Business Global studio. as of the time of this recording, I know that 17 Britons are feared missing or dead in Israel. I'm not sure about the number for American citizens, but they are among hostages that have been kidnapped by Hamas and have been taken into Gaza. What response are you expecting?
Yeah, at least 20 are hostages. 14 are confirmed dead in terms of U.S. citizens. I think so far President Biden and Netanyahu have said the right things. They seem to have a unified front, which hasn't been the case until last weekend. You know, the relationship was uncomfortable, to say the least. Biden was being much more patronizing or appeasing to Iran, and that was very upsetting to the Israelis. He also got involved in the Supreme Court dispute in Israel, and it really wasn't a good relationship. He was focused much more. You know, he managed to unsettle the relationship both with Israel and with the Saudis, while appeasing and supporting Iran. That doesn't sit well with Netanyahu, to say the least. So I think this past weekend changed that relationship. Yeah. And so far we've seen, you know, a real commitment from President Biden.
I very briefly and quickly, most importantly, want to get your opinion on defense aid for Israel by Washington. You've spent goodness knows how much on Ukraine.
Yeah.
How do you balance that?
It's a great question. And I think right now is the wrong time to be cutting defense spending overall. Okay. So I think you'll have massive support for supporting Israel. The only people who won't are the radical left activists, the AOC branch of the Democratic Party. That's not going to move the needle. So I think you saw from President Biden, again, both Saturday and yesterday, Blinken made a mistake out of the gates, you know, and he said he was encouraging a ceasefire and, you know, everybody dial it down. That's surrender if you do that. You know, unfortunately, that's just the way war is. That's, you know, like surrendering on on Pearl Harbor Day. But I think what we're going to have to see is real support from the U.S., not just in terms of what President Biden is saying. He's sent two carriers, actually. Right. He's got one on the way. The Gerald Ford is almost there. So I think so far so good in terms of the commitment to Israel. That's, if anything, helped the U.S.-Israeli relationship. It goes back a long way.
No, you're absolutely right. And difficult questions for him to answer. He obviously is the leader of the free world. But then, of course, we cannot forget the innocent Palestinians who are going to be caught.
And it's a shame that Hamas is using them as human shields like they always have. And it puts Israel in a really difficult position. But I don't think they have a choice now. I think they have to eradicate Hamas.
Greg Swenson, Chairman, Republicans Overseas UK, and of course the founding partner of investment firm Brigg McAdam. Thank you.
Thanks, Juliana.
Thank you. Well, the situation in Gaza is frightening, with thousands dead and even more wounded. Reporter Alex MacDonald, who is also a commentator at Middle East Eye, joined me in the studio for his assessment. Alex MacDonald, it's a pleasure having you in the channel's Business Global studio today. I'd like your reaction to a letter, I believe, that the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, sent to police chiefs across the United Kingdom, basically asking them to consider whether displays of support for Palestine, including chants and flags, could be public order offences. Now, we know that Rishi Sunak has unequivocally stated that he stands with Israel. We've also had similar sentiment from the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. However, I believe on Monday night, there were pro-Palestinian protests, shall we say, gatherings in certain parts of London. So it's a very dicey situation in the UK at the moment. Yeah,
it's quite peculiar, really, to sort of suggest that you can ban the Palestinian flag, because I mean, the UK, you know, has relations with the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian mission to the UK exists in this country. You know, there is a Palestinian ambassador, and the national flag of Palestine is the flag that gets flown at those protests. So, I mean, I don't really understand what that would mean if you were to then ban the flag. I mean, I suppose you could ban it in certain situations or certain contexts, but I mean, that's extremely dicey for any police officers to make a judgment on. I mean, it seems to me is just, you know, it is a very much kind of a gesture politics on Braverman's part. There is a very kind of long-running culture war, I would say, in the UK on the subject of Israel-Palestine that, in my view, has very little to do with what's actually happening in the region. And it's seen as Palestinian solidarity is seen very much as a left-wing political issue. And for people like Braverman, therefore, kind of staunch support for Israel is seen as the kind of counterpoint to that. And, when you talk about things like banning the Palestinian flag or flying the Palestinian flag, she's thinking, I would suggest, of, say, Labour Party conferences a few years ago where the Palestinian flag was flown en masse by activists. And in her mind, it's a kind of political ploy to try and, target the Labour Party, even though, of course, the leadership of the Labour Party now is much more pro-Israel than they used to be.
I want your opinion on 2 points, really, both coming from the EU. First of all, the fact that they had to very quickly reverse their decision to send aid to Palestine, which a lot of people thought that was just absolutely terrible decision. I think Antonio Guterres, UN General Secretary, had to step in and, show his concerns. And then secondly, just recently, they've issued a 24-hour warning to Elon Musk, CEO now of X, formerly known as Twitter, basically saying that he needs to put an end to the disinformation from the Hamas side of what's taking place. Talk to me about what's happening there.
Well, on the subject of the erstwhile platform known as Twitter, on that subject, I mean, there has been a huge mass of disinformation being spread on there, which, to anyone who's been following Musk's stewardship of Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, should come as no surprise, because it basically now exists with an algorithm and with a verification process that amplifies disinformation, conspiracy theories, and misinformation. So, yeah, I mean, he does need to do something about it. But of course, it's obviously not just from the kind of Palestinian side. There's been plenty of pro-Israeli misinformation spread as well. I mean, for example, there has been a massive amplification of the claims about, for example, 40 children being beheaded, which seems to now be getting a lot of holes punched in it, by a lot of mainstream outlets that previously reported it.
Yes, I think the German party goer with the dreadlocks as well.
Yes.
Apparently, she may not be dead. It's the latest.
I don't see what the EU. I mean, when they were talking about suspending aid to Gaza, I mean, what do they see as the end result of that? I mean, unless you...
to flush out Hamas.
Well, how does that flush?
I don't agree with the decision, but I think that's the sentiment, really.
I'm sure that is what
is the sentiment.
I'm sure that's what they would argue. But I mean, on a very practical level, if it doesn't actually fulfill that aim, because frankly, Hamas, I mean, you only have to look, by the way, at public support for Hamas in Gaza, and it always peaks around times of violence or times of kind of intensified repression. That there's when things calm down in the Gaza Strip, of course, calm is always relative because it's under blockade and continuing occupation, and et cetera, but Hamas's support tends to drop off. It is a group which is bolstered by Israel's actions.
Do you think it's been bolstered now? Do you think the Palestinians support what took place in southern Israel last weekend?
I don't have any kind of polling to suggest whether they do or not, and I wouldn't like to speculate. But this it has been the failing of the kind of the recognized so-called moderate Palestinian factions over the last several decades that has led to the support for Hamas growing. It has been the inability of the Palestinian Authority, of Fatah, led by President Mahmoud Abbas, who has been in power long beyond his elected mandate. It's been their failure to get any achievement, to achieve anything in terms of negotiations with Israel, failure to change the situation on the ground, while at the same time constantly making concessions and constantly giving away more and more sort of controlling rights to Israel. That has led to Hamas's increase in support.
Apparently things are going to get worse, unfortunately, before they get better. But it's an awful situation. But thank you very much for the insight you've provided today. Alex McDonald, who's a reporter and also a commentator at Middle East Eye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up on Channel's Business Global, the leader of Britain's opposition has promised to fight the next general election on economic growth, refuting the government's claims that the Labour Party would bankrupt Britain. Harry Burns, the Vice President of Crestview Strategy, was at this year's annual conference, and he'll shortly be joining me with the highlights. And I'll, of course, be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. All of this after the break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In a moment, I'll be sharing an interview I conducted with Harry Burns, the Senior Vice President of Crestview Strategy. But until then, here's a breakdown of the biggest business news stories of the week. Workers at an Amazon site in England will strike for 4 days next month due to an ongoing dispute over pay. Members of the GMB union will walk out on November 7th, 8th, 9th, and on the 24th, which is Black Friday. The union said it will be the biggest day of strike action in Amazon's history, involving more than 1,000 workers. The move comes despite the retail giant announcing a pay rise for its staff of at least £1 an hour, which will come into effect from October the 15th. Stockholm is to become the first major city in the world to introduce a wide prohibition of petrol and diesel cars. According to local media reports, beginning from 2025, parts of central Stockholm that straddles the Swedish capital's finance area will be off limits for petrol and diesel cars, allowing only electric cars, hybrid trucks and other fuel cell vehicles. Other cities, including London, have begun introducing low emission zones that include daily fees for entering the city centre in older combustion engines. Metro Bank shares rallied by as much as 30% on Monday after the embattled British lender struck a fundraising deal over the weekend to bolster its balance sheet. James Jelinski, the Colombian billionaire banker who will take a controlling stake in Metro, is reportedly seeking an exemption from UK takeover rules that would normally require him to bid for the entire firm. Now to our final topic. Sir Keir Starmer has promised to fight the next election on economic growth. This is what he said at the Labour Party's annual conference, which took place in Liverpool earlier this week. Despite his keynote being disrupted here by a demonstrator.
True democracy is citizen-led. Politics needs an update. We demand a people's house. We demand a people's house.
Sir Keir promised to hold out the hands of partnership to business, laying claim to traditional Conservative strengths as a way of winning over Tory voters.
Sometimes the old Labour ideas are right for new times. So where there are good jobs, where there is good infrastructure, where there's good land for affordable homes, we'll get shovels in the ground, cranes in the sky, and build the next generation of Labour new towns. The Tories know that. They stood at this crossroads before. They called it levelling up. But as soon as they counted their votes, they turned back. Back to the comfort of the easy answer. Back to the trickle-down nonsense that sees wealth trickle up and jobs trickle out. You cannot understate this. Those ideas are finished, blown away by a world where tyrants like Putin pay little regard to the niceties of market dogma, but also because in the end, they always make working people pay. You saw it last year. Tax cuts for the richest, the pound sinking like a stone, a wrecking ball to our finances, economic shrapnel everywhere, family budget shredded, a £300 billion bill, the only remedy, Labour stability.
Well, for more on this, I was earlier joined in the studio by Harry Burns, the Vice President of Crestview Strategy. Harry is a member of the Labour Party and was in Liverpool for the gathering. Harry Burns, it's a pleasure having you back in the Channel's Business Global studio. Of course, we know the Labour Party conference has been overshadowed by events taking place in the Middle East. But Sir Keir Starmer, obviously leading in the polls, it was supposed to be an election-winning speech. Did he deliver on it?
Well, it was certainly the best speech that he's ever given at a Labour conference. I think it's the best speech he's probably ever given anywhere. There was a great feeling in the conference hall. Everybody's very energised by it. because there was a genuine feeling that this might be the last speech that he gives at a conference before he's Prime Minister. And so clearly, he enthused the people in the hall. And actually, just by listening to people's conversations on the train coming down here today, people were actually talking about it. A colleague of mine said that he had 5 people on their train talking about Keir's speech. Wow. And I don't think Keir's ever had that sort of cut through. So it's certainly a positive step forward, but there's still a very long way to go. Over a year probably to the next general election, and things can change so incredibly quickly.
Absolutely. We know 24 hours is a long time in politics. What were some of the other highlights? I know Rachel Reeves, she got a rousing reception from Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor. I'm sure that would have hurt Rishi Sunak. Who else kind of topped the... So
Rachel's fantastic. She's a very safe pair of hands. And I think anybody that looks at the Labour Party can be reassured that she would be a safe person to run the Treasury.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. She used to work for the Bank of England. She's an economist by trade. She's not going to be making it up on the spot. She's not going to have to get a Economics for Dummies book before becoming Chancellor. This really is her area of expertise, and so she's fantastic. But
She said she's going to bankrupt Britain.
But of course he said that. But this is a man that has presided over 13 years of failed economic policy, which has led to the country not growing. We haven't had a consistent period of economic growth since Labour were in power. We used to rely on the Tories to be the party of economic competence, but they've just shown themselves to have, completely walked away from that through Brexit, through severing their ties with business. Business were back at Labour conference in their droves wanting to have conversations with Keir and Rachel, because they know that Labour have a plan for a long-term industrial strategy where they look at long-term decision making rather than short-term decisions taken for political expediency's sake, like HS2. I don't know if your viewers are aware of the saga of HS2, but it's been going on for 16, 17 years. We can't even build a railway track in this country. What does that say to the world of investors? It says that Britain's not really open for business.
What are the other highlights?
So I went to a fantastic event with David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. I'm often sceptical about British foreign policy when it comes to Africa, because I feel like, unlike a lot of the world, we haven't quite got the message that Africa is no longer somebody that, a continent that we should pity and look at through the lens of charity, but it is, the future superpower of the world. And David Lammy said that the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office need to completely change the way they think about Africa. They need to see African countries as equal partners. They need to stop lecturing to Africa, and they need to start working on rebuilding those relationships, because it's going to be these relationships that pay off significantly in terms of Britain's exports going into the future.
Absolutely. I said at the beginning that of course the events were overshadowed by what's taking place in the Middle East. Do you think the party is still haunted by the legacy of Jeremy Corbyn, who, by the way, has towed the line this time in terms of his response, calling out Hamas and also calling out, the response by Israel in Gaza?
I think the party is certainly motivated by what happened in the past to never let that happen again. Yeah. When Corbyn was in power, Labour certainly lost all credibility with the British public because we were no longer the party that could be trusted with the national defence. We can no longer be trusted to stand with our NATO allies against the tyrannical regimes around the world. And so I think Labour is very clear that the party has changed under Keir. And I rejoined the party because Keir has changed the party so much, because he's stamped out anti-Semitism in the party, and he started to make them a serious party again of government. But you can never be too complacent. You always have to keep working at this and never allow the poison that was allowed to flourish under Corbyn to ever get back into the party again.
Just finally, I think it would be amiss if I didn't ask for your reaction to what's happening in the Middle East, the British response, Keir's response, and what you think how it's going to play out.
Well, I think from a Labour perspective, it's completely unequivocal support for Israel. Now's not the time to be litigating the reasons that that have led to us getting to this position.
Can't be justified.
No, absolutely not. No, and Keir's been very clear about that. The message was very clear across Labour conference. In the past, you would have had factions in their small meeting rooms.
That didn't happen?
It didn't happen at all. No,
David Lammy wasn't pictured
no.
with a Palestinian sympathiser?
There are, of course, Palestinian sympathisers within the Labour Party, because Because of course they're right. You know, it's been a party that has stood in solidarity with Palestine for a very long time. But that doesn't mean that you can't believe in both things, that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself, that they should be supported to take whatever action is necessary to stop this from ever happening again, whilst also looking at the long-term underlying causes that, you know, Labour still believe a two-state solution is the only way to get out of this mess in the long term. But for now, you've got to stand with Israel unequivocally.
Absolutely. Harry Burns, Vice President, Crestview Strategy, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Cheers. Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today. But as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.